Hello and welcome to the first of these tutorial videos. We're going to be looking today at putting together a quick mix. I'm starting with a song by a family band called Again. Pretty much I set myself a 2-hour limit to put together this mix using the Waves NLS plugins and the Avid channel strip. All the processing is done with those two. I wanted to kind of recreate working on a console and showing the workflow and my process of putting together a mix quickly. Now, one of the first things I do when I get a session is I go through and color code the tracks and trim the regions to show where stuff enters and exits the song. It helps me find things easier and see where stuff's coming in. Here you have the drums for the track. We've got a really simple kick, snare, mono overhead setup. I'm using the mic setting on all of the NLS channels. They're controlled through a VCA, which we'll get to later. You can see here on the kick we're using a little bit of compression, filtering out quite a bit of the top end because a lot of this was recorded to tape and we've got a bit more hiss than I would like. You can see I'm mostly using broad EQ strokes here. The snare and mono overhead also feature the same. We're looking to move quickly through this. I'm still taking out some of that top and same sort of approach for EQ. We've got a parallel compression there named NYC, which is just the way that I learned to refer to it. Using a lot of compression with heavy filtering on that track. The filters are actually pre-dynamic, so you can see there that you're able to rearrange the processing order really easily in the channel strip, which gives you a lot more flexibility dialing in your sounds. As part of this, I set up the EQ following the compressor so those changes won't affect it. So that just kind of helps tighten up and add a little bit more smack to the drums. Here we added in the bass. You can see we're adding some drive here with the NLS. And then a pretty heavy dose of compression on the bass. We've got a higher ratio. I'm also using a lot of filtering to get rid of the same tape hiss and make it sound more bassy. Generally when I'm doing rough mixes, I'll use a lot more compression than I would otherwise, just to help hold everything in place. Here's the guitar. This is the other main rhythm section instrument. So we've got the same settings with NLS through our VCA. We've got a different knee on this one, also filtering before the compressor and then adding back in the EQ afterwards. So now we'll add in the lead vocal and look at the VCA settings for NLS. Here's the VCA window. You're able to globally affect everything that's added into the VCA group. It makes it really easy to audition different consoles and add global drive. I'm adding 2 dB of drive from the VCA page to every track throughout the session. It's easier to add it globally and then just adjust on a track-by-track basis as you need. You're also able to switch between the different consoles from this page, which makes it, again, easy to hear how they're affecting the sound differently and which is best suited for the song. Give the young one up. So with the EQ approach to this, I'm taking out the tape hiss again and some of the low end, also using a bit more compression on the vocal, bringing up some of the top to help it stick out from the rest of the track, which is darker. You can see here the effects. I'm using 2 reverbs on the vocal, a spring and then a short plate sort of setting. And then we've also got a delay that I just have at the same level throughout the whole track. Normally I get into more automation of those throws, but we're doing this quick. You can see here that we're using some broad volume automation strokes to bring out certain sections of the vocal. Normally I'd get more into doing that with fader rides, but again, rough mix. Here a background comes in, pan that off to the left and also filtered it quite a bit. I'm not using any time-based effects on this background. I wanted it to exist in a different space than the vocal and improve the contrast between the lead and background. Through here. Now we'll look at some of the reverbs that I'm using. The short haul setting, I've got 2 different reverbs set, panned hard left and right. You can see we're using a little bit different pre-delay and reverb time as well as different early reflections. This is one of my favorite tricks for getting a wider soundstage. A lot of times I'll go through and set this up manually as you see here. It gives you a lot more control over it than using a multi-channel reverb, and I like to be able to tailor each side. For the track titled Long Haul here, I'm actually using Deverb. I've got it set up with just under 3 seconds of delay, and then we're using a pretty heavy dose of pre-delay again. Here we've got the spring, which I'm using on the drums and vocal. I generally like to use as few independent reverbs as possible. It helps create a more cohesive sound space for the track as a whole. And that's especially true with all of the lap steels and melodica, which are all using the same reverb. The main atmosphere of the song is provided by the lap steel tracks here, which we'll look at. I have the trim here pulled way down. It's a handy feature in NLS and one that I would use on consoles, using the line trim to set your level before you hit compressors or any other processing. What I'll generally do is do a quick pass of the song and set my levels on faders, and then go through and copy those fader levels to the trim and then bring my faders up to unity. This way you have a higher resolution when you're doing rides, and it really helps you control the way your compressors react to the signal. You can see we've got all the trims here, some filtering and just basic EQ on those. Again, everything's just designed to move quickly through this. You see here that we've got the trims which match my original fader levels. Another handy feature is you can do a global trim through the VCA page, which is handy for if you have something where everything's tracked really low, like if it's an orchestral date, or really hot too, if someone's been printing in from tape. We'll take a quick look at the overall mixer page, and that's a view of the pans, and you can also see that all of the lap steel tracks are using the same reverb and delays. We also used a similar level on those sends to keep it very cohesive. I used the delay setting not so much to create an audible delay, but to smooth out a lot of the transitions, especially in the melodica and some of the lap steel handoffs. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and look at the melodica a little bit closer here. And the melodica in this track really changes the feel once it comes in. You can see again there that we're using the line trim, and then as far as the EQ goes, I'm not actually doing anything to it. It had a really cool sound that I was happy with the way it was sitting in the mix with the drive that we're adding from the VCA page. You can see there's a quick automation trim for the swell that comes in here, so we don't lose the melodica. When I'm doing these rough mixes, I generally use the trimmer tool to do all of my volume automation. It's a quick way to pull stuff up and down without having to get into fader rides. This guitar is a perfect example of the way I'll use the trimmer tool for automation in a rough. We're doing a bit of pan automation here, you'll see, after the second chord when it comes back in later in the song. And now that's something that, in the end, we may decide, oh, that's a little distracting, but when putting together these roughs, I usually like to find a couple things I can spread out. Speaking of which, we have this little happy accident here. So there's this guitar that comes in at the very end, and it's an acoustic that was recorded with a guide scratch vocal. I decided after finding this track that I wanted the end to widen up, and so you would actually hear this separate vocal. I used the same spring reverb that's on the lead vocal, and then filtered the track heavily, treated it more for the guitar than the vocal. As part of this, I automated the pan on our lead vocal track to bring it over to the opposite channel. That way you'll hear it, especially on the word endings, but that it's two different tracks.
Give the young one up. Let the old one rest.
And that actually turned into one of my favorite parts of the song, hearing the vocal split apart there at the end. Let's go ahead and take a look at the percussion tracks now that come in about halfway through the song. We have a shaker and a tambourine, and I approach the two of them differently here. You'll see help create even more contrast between them. We've got the shaker just filtered heavily, get to that really mid-rangey sound. This also provides a nice contrast to the tambourine track. We left that top end wide open, just taking out some of the bottom so that it really brightens up towards the end of the song and helps build up the conclusion of the track. Everything else in the song doesn't have much top end added. Usually pulling stuff down, I wanted to keep it a really kind of dark and earthy sort of sound. That carries over into these background vocals. And now here, grouping is something that will really help when you're putting together a quick mix. I've got all of these background vocals running into a subgroup. I use the NLS both on the individual channels and on the subgroup to add even more drive to it. pretty heavy dose of compression and then also EQing it, but the EQ is boosting after the compressor. We've got it filtered out on the top and it just helps it sit in the back a little bit more. I'm not using any time-based effects on these, same as with the solo background line, except for this Leslie here. And the simulator is thickening up the backgrounds and also changing the tone to help differentiate it even more from the lead vocal. So I'm processing them more as an instrument than as a vocal per se. So that's gotten us through most of the individual elements. Let's go ahead and take a look at the bus processing that I'm using on this mix. I print through a stereo aux to a new audio track for my inserts on the bus. We started out here using the NLS bus with a lot of drive added. I find that I usually need to add less to individual channels once it's on the master. This is running separate from our VCA group, and then I've got a channel strip here with a little bit of 2-bus compression and a touch of EQ added in there on the top. The drive on the bus plugin sounds really fantastic. A lot of times I'll mix through subgroups and add that to each one of the subs to add a little bit more character to the overall mix. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to check out the links and download the song yourself. We've got the session posted and all the original files so you can go through and put together your own mix. Post any questions you have in the comments, and I'll talk to you soon.